So we began last week a new set of sermons, a new series under the title Sightline. And that is what we're going to continue on with today. We're looking in these sermons at specific passages from the Gospels. And they are passages that share one common element, and that element is this. They all contain references to Jesus, very specifically seeing someone, looking at someone, or watching someone. Basically, passages that communicate this intimate sightline that Jesus has into the lives of people. A sightline being defined as an unobstructed line of sight between an intentional observer and a subject of interest. When Jesus sees these people in the stories we're going to unpack during this series, he sees them truly and deeply. And the big takeaway is he still sees you. And he still sees me. God still has a divine sightline into each one of our lives. So this morning we're going to look at a particular passage where Jesus has an interaction, a brief one, but a powerful interaction with the crowds, and hence the title, Compassion for the Crowds. We're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 9, just a few verses. That'll be our launching point for this morning. So if you have a Bible and you want to follow along there, Matthew chapter 9 is where we will begin, but the words will be up behind me. And we start reading in verse 35. Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. And when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them, because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. And then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field." So here we have a very brief exchange where we're told that Jesus saw the crowds. Again, this is an example where the dialogue or the narrative could have simply said that he had compassion, but he saw them. He had a divine sightline into this crowd of people following him, clamoring for healing and help and hope. And we see that he is describing, in the text, the crowds are described as being harassed and helpless. Now, I want to start, we're going to zero in on that phrase, those two words, harassed and helpless. If you are holding today a translation of the Bible that's different than the one I used, which I read from the NIV, you may notice that there is some difference in the way that our Bibles translate those two words for harassed and helpless, right? And part of the reason is that in the original language, and we are going to get a little Greeky today, I have some Greek stuff to unpack. I think it's fantastic, so hopefully you are excited about it. But these two words occur very, very seldom other than the places in which we find them. And when you have less and less context for a word, it makes it harder to really zoom in and zero in on an exact translation. And so that's why we see some variety, including, just here's a list of some of the translations that I found and the variety within them. Those two words get translated instead as wearied and cast away, fainted and scattered, distressed and dejected, weary and worn out, distressed and downcast, fatigued and forlorn, or dejected and deserted. And one of the things I love about some of these translations is they hold to some of the original intent even closer than just the words themselves, because in the original language, both of these words for harassed and helpless start with the same letter and have the same number of syllables. And so there's this sort of rhythmic idea to what Jesus is saying. So I love it when those translations carry on that tradition, distressed and downcast. There's this flow to it, right? So Jesus is describing this crowd of people as harassed and helpless. The other reason these words are challenging is that they are both examples of words that could be taken literally in the language, but here are understood figuratively. Literally versus figuratively. Now I can hear some of you thinking, I haven't been in English class for a while, so can we just a quick refresher on that? Sure. So the difference between literal and figurative is this. We still do it today a lot in our own language and the way that we speak. For instance, if you know someone who works in the restaurant industry as a server or something like that, they might say like, wow, it was crazy last night at the restaurant because we were slammed with people. Were they literally slammed? Probably not, right? But it communicates the pressure that they felt because of all the people and the needs and the demands that they might have had. Or how about this one? Have you ever used this phrase, I just feel like I'm falling apart? Are you literally falling apart? Now, some of you might be like, you have no idea. Some days, I actually am, right? But for the most part, we figuratively mean that we feel like we are falling apart. Or how about this one? If you have a lot of things to do or a lot of details to remember, you might say, I just feel like my head is spinning. You know, our heads are not literally spinning around in a circle, but we communicate what we are feeling using that language, and we take it figuratively. So all of these things are happening here in this passage. Let's look at the first word itself. The word for harassed is skulo, which literally means to skin or flay something, literally, or figuratively, like here, is meant to communicate to trouble or to be troubled, right? To skin or to flay something. That communicates a certain feeling, right? Now, I have never skinned or flayed an animal of any sort or any kind. I have no real desire to do so. I have no experience firsthand. I don't even like peeling oranges, right? So I don't know how that literal thing with my own firsthand experience feel, but I can imagine what's being communicated by this idea, the peeling of skin and the feeling of that, right? We even still have a phrase like that today that you probably have used when something's happening and you say, man, this is really getting under my skin. Is it literally getting under your skin? Probably not, right? But this is what's behind this word, this skulo, this harassed. These people are being troubled, right? So that kind of leads us to this question today. What is it that gets under your skin? And there may be things that nominally get under your skin that are annoyances, but there may be other things that, really, if they are intense enough or long-term enough, they bother you to the point that they disrupt your life, right? Or maybe a question about what do you feel like wears you out or tears you down? You know, the idea of the tearing away of the flesh. What tears you apart? What wears you down? That's all behind this idea of what it means to be helpless in this translation. And the good news is this: God sees you when the world wears you out or tears you down. Jesus saw the crowds and he saw their helplessness. And God sees you and he sees me. And when we feel like we are being torn apart, worn out, torn down, that we are seen. We are in the divine sight line of God. How about that second word? The one for helpless is ripto, which literally means to throw or hurl or abandon or neglect or cast off or throw aside. Figuratively is understood as to be discouraged or dejected. This word is used in the book of Acts. There's a scene where people are on a boat and they want to rid the boat of weight, and so they are taking things and throwing those things overboard, to cast away, to cast aside, to throw away, right? And throwing things away is something that we are very, very familiar with in our world today. I probably don't have to tell you this, but do you realize that we live in a very disposable world, right? We live in a disposable world. And here's what I mean by that. I read an article this week about how disposable our world has become. And I want to share with you two just anecdotes that I think are fantastic. Here's the first one from the article that I read. See if you can find a shoemaker within 50 miles of your home. Chances are you cannot. But you will find 50 to 60 shoe stores and chains ready and willing to sell you another pair, right? So I took them up on this. I did the experiment. I got on the Google. Actually, I probably did it this way, but I got on the Google, and I didn't type in shoemaker because for some reason the term shoemaker conveys within me like Disney and elves and for some reason something like that. So I typed the word cobbler in because that made more sense to me. And I might have been hungry at the same time. But I typed in cobbler, search, and do you know how many cobblers I found in a radius from here to approximately Youngstown? Three. So then I got back on and I typed in shoe store, and do you know how many shoe stores I found just within that same general radius? Over 20. And that does not include department stores like Walmart that sell shoes along with a bunch of other things. So it's probably true that within that same circumference is probably 30, 40 or more shoe stores, right? And we could have a discussion about the cost of shoes and the quality of construction and things like that, but it's simply true that we are becoming a more and more disposable society. Here's the other anecdote that I thought was quite interesting. There was a survey done in 2008, so over 10 years ago at this point, a survey about the size of the trash cans in our houses. And they compared the sizes of today's trash cans with the sizes of family household trash cans just 2 decades ago, 20 years. Do you know by what percentage our trash cans are larger today than they were just 2 decades ago? Yeah, I hear some mumbling and some thinking, so I'll give you a moment. And the answer is 75%. Our trash cans are 75% larger than just 2 decades ago, and yet we still fill them up quite regularly and take them out and put them by the curb. So why do I say all this about a disposable world and society? Because I think one of the things that's happening is that whether we realize it or not, we take this attitude of disposability and we transfer it to people. I think we sometimes treat people as if they are disposable. And I'd like to say that within the church we see this less, and I think maybe we do, but I think it's a screaming example of what's happening in the world, that we treat people as if they're disposable, because we live in a disposable world. And the people in this passage, the crowds, they have been cast off, cast aside, thrown away, treated as if they were simply disposable. So here's the good news in all of that. God sees you when the world casts you aside or neglects your needs. Jesus looked at this crowd. He saw that they were both helpless and harassed, that they had been cast aside, that they were literally, figuratively laid down and helpless. And he looked at them and he saw them, and he sees you and he sees me when we feel cast aside, thrown out, or neglected. And when Jesus saw them as harassed and helpless, he had one response, and that was a response of deep compassion. We read that he had compassion on them. So one more opportunity to get Greeky. The word for compassion, it's a fun one to say, splanchnisomai. Right? Splanchnisomai. And literally that word in the Greek means spleen or bowels, literally. And figuratively, obviously, means compassion, pity, empathy, especially concerning the suffering of other people, right? That Greek word literally talked about the organs on the inside of your body. And I'm sure probably none of you today in an emotional situation go, my spleen just hurts right now, right? We don't talk like that. However, think about this. We still use phrases like this today. We would say something like, I was there and it was gut-wrenching, right? Or I saw this thing and it was heartbreaking. We still use those concepts and those ideas. Experiencing something gut-wrenching or heartbreaking. Same concept, right? I read this in a commentary. I want to share this quote with you. What causes Jesus deep compassion at this point is not the abundance of sickness he has seen, but rather the great spiritual need of the people whose lives have no center, whose existence seem aimless, and whose experience is one of futility. I read that indictment and I thought, boy, man, just as true today. There are so many lives that seem aimless, that seem like they don't have a center. Or we choose things for our lives and put them in the center, and those things can't hold the weight of life like we expect them to or want them to. And the thing about what Jesus has for these crowds, compassion or sympathy, those are both words that communicate feeling something along with another person. Compassion means to suffer with. Sympathy means to feel with. You see, Jesus did not look at the crowds and keep them distant at an arm's length. He did not distance himself physically or emotionally. What is communicated in the text is he allowed himself to feel the same kind of burdens they were feeling. He felt it along with them deeply. And this shouldn't surprise us because on the cross, that's what we believe, that Jesus was identifying with us, that he was deeply feeling what it means to feel what we feel. So he had compassion, and he still does today. A great reminder that God sees your heartbreak, and his heart breaks along with yours. In doing counseling, sometimes people ask hard questions, really good but hard questions. And the one that I get often is, where is God in the middle of all of this? In the middle of the gut-wrenching and the heartbreaking, where is God? And I know it's not a complete answer or one that maybe is totally satisfactory, but part of my answer is always, his heart is breaking right along with yours. He has compassion on you, for you, and with you. And so Jesus sees the helpless and the harassed, and he has compassion. And what is his response? It's a really interesting phrase. He says, they seem like they are sheep without a shepherd. Sheep without a shepherd. An interesting turn, right? Because he's talking about helplessness and things like that. But it's really not all that strange if you lodge what Jesus is saying in the midst of a long lineage in the Old Testament of this idea of sheep and shepherds. I'm going to read you 3 passages of Scripture, each one a little shorter than the one that came before. And I just want you to listen and let sink in these references to God as shepherd and us as sheep. Starting with Ezekiel 34, verses 11 through 16. For this is what the sovereign Lord says, I myself will search for my sheep and look after them. As a shepherd looks after his scattered flock when he is with them, so will I look after my sheep. I will rescue them from all the places where they were scattered on a day of clouds and darkness. I will bring them out from the nations and gather them from countries. I will bring them into their own land. I will pasture them on the mountains of Israel and the ravines and in all the settlements of the land. I will tend them in a good pasture, and the mountain heights of Israel will be their grazing land. There they will lie down in good grazing land. There they will feed in a rich pasture on the mountains of Israel. I myself will tend my sheep and have them lie down, declares the sovereign Lord. I will search for the lost and bring back the strays. I will bind up the injured and strengthen the weak. So there's a proclamation of the idea. Here's a poetic version. Maybe you've heard this one from Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures, and he leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. And even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, and my cup overflows. Surely goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. So we have proclamation, poem, and then from the very words of Jesus in John 10, I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me, and I lay down my life for those sheep. So if you get nothing else out of the sermon today, you take nothing else home with you, take this truth. When the world tears you down and tosses you aside, there is a good shepherd who reaches for you, rescues you, and restores you. He reaches for you, rescues you, and restores you. We see this play out a lot in the words of Psalm 23. I chose this picture. I really like it because Jesus has rescued that one sheep, and I notice it's the black sheep, the black sheep of the family, the one that maybe has run the furthest and gone the farthest, and yet Jesus brings the black sheep home. Psalm 23 communicates powerful truths like this one. God's care for his sheep is not outsourced to a third party, which we're used to in our world. How many of you have phoned customer service and been told, well, that actually is handled by this department, we farmed it out to them. Well, actually, they take care of that, and you follow this breadcrumb trail that eventually leads you most of the time to nowhere, to be honest, right? We're so used to things being another level away, and yet, did you notice how many times, especially in the Ezekiel passage, God says, I myself will shepherd my sheep. I will bring them out. I will take them to the mountains of Israel. God does not outsource his care for his sheep. He does it himself. Or how about this truth? God intends for his sheep to not merely survive, but to thrive. Did you notice how many times when it talks about the pasture for God's people, the words that were used? Good pasture, rich pasture, green pasture. This is not a deserted area with mostly sand and dirt and a patch of grass here and there. It is a rich and wide expanse for God's people. And in Psalm 23, we get the language of, he anoints my head with oil and my cup overflows. Have any of you ever read that and gone, that sounds gross and messy? You know, oil all over my head, a cup overflowing, spilling out, making a mess, right? But there's buried in that ancient text, there's so much wisdom. I want to share this with you. In the ancient Near East, anointing the head with oil was a great refreshment. There are three qualities of this oil: a smoothness to the touch, brightness to the sight, and fragrance to the nose. And so gratifying to the senses, it caused delight to those anointed with it. In this same culture, guests would be given a cup or a glass of some choice wine, which the host was very careful to fill until it ran over. The idea of anointing your head with oil, totally foreign to us. But think about it. In sort of a Middle Eastern, dry, maybe even desert culture, if you're walking for hours or days or weeks at a time in that environment, and then somebody puts oil over your head, the softness it brings to your skin, the visible brightness that enhances the smell that goes into your nose that has been all dried out, and how refreshing that would have been. And then the idea of hospitality, that as you took in a guest into your home to welcome them, that you would give them some of the best that you had to offer, and you would fill their cup, and you would not let them take it away until it overflowed the edges. And we might say, but that's a waste. But God's love is reckless, and it overflows to communicate that you are welcome, that you are brought in to this community of God's people. Another thing from Psalm 23 and even the Ezekiel passage, to receive restorative care from the Good Shepherd requires us to lie down. Did you see how many times that was included in those passages? And they will lie down. In the Ezekiel passage several times, and then in Psalm 23, like they will lie down. And I don't know about you, I was really convicted this week about that phrase, lying down as a sheep in God's sheepfold. And it probably doesn't happen to you guys, but it happens to me. When I feel spiritually injured or spiritually weak, I think it's quite possible that I'm just choosing not to lie still and lie down long enough for the Good Shepherd to take care of me. We are invited to lie down, to let the Good Shepherd care for us, to heal what might be broken, to strengthen what might be weakened. And sometimes it's just, there's so much going on in life that we do feel worn down, but I think sometimes, maybe a lot of the time, it's that we are not willing to prioritize and commit to lying down to allow the Good Shepherd to do his caring work for us and in us. And here's the last thing that we see in these passages about sheep and shepherds. All of this intimate, overflowing, life-giving care is an absolute gift of grace. As a sheep, you cannot earn the care of the shepherd. You will never deserve the care of the shepherd, but it is a gift of grace that you have been given. I want to finish up by reading a passage from actually a blog post that I read this week from a woman named Nadia Bolz-Weber, and she talks about the truth about sheep and the truth about shepherds, right? I want to just listen to this and allow it to sink in, the truth about sheep and shepherds. She writes and she says, the truth about sheep is that I don't want to be one. The only sheep I've ever seen have been the sad, filthy, caged ones in the petting zoos. I mean, given the choice, I'd be a wolf or maybe a shepherd, but never a sheep. Sheep are stupid and docile and easily manipulated. I want to make my own choices and go my own way, even, it should be noted, if those choices and that way are killing me. While I wish Jesus had said, I am the good friend or the good therapist or the good coach, because I'd rather think of myself as a friend or a client or an athlete, there's nothing wrong with the fact that I am a sheep of God's keeping and that you are a sheep of God's keeping, because it is the truth. And why should we fear the truth if it's the thing that Jesus said would set us free? The truth is that when we wander off and try to get our needs met through all the wrong ways and allow others to be our shepherd, and when we are dumb and let the wolves in, and when we do all the other things that sheep just do, well, it doesn't mean that we're not worthy to have a good shepherd. It just makes it all that much better news that we have a good shepherd. And here's the truth about that shepherd. The shepherd never mentions the type or quality of sheep he demands. And I love this line. The shepherd never holds auditions. The shepherd never bases his protection and love and concern for his sheep on how the sheep look or feel or behave. That's never mentioned as a basis for belonging to the flock of the good shepherd. The truth about the shepherd is that despite all of our mess, he calls us by name. We know the voice. It is always there, under the clamor of insecurity and the cry of the wolves and the murmurs of our own internal sense of unworthiness. The voice of the one who lays down his life for us, who lays down his love for us, the rebellious and smelly sheep, is always right there saying, you belong to me. And to that I say, amen. A few things to think about, consider, and pray about as we close our time together. Here's the first one. Have you been worn out, torn down, or cast aside by the world? If so, receive the compassion of Jesus. If you feel like you're on God's sight line, just as Jesus saw the crowds that were harassed and helpless, just know that Jesus has compassion for you. Secondly, do you feel burdened by the weight of religious or institutional rules or regulations? Ask Jesus to teach you about the freedom of his light and easy yoke. I didn't get into it this morning in the interest of time, but Jesus had to be a shepherd for those people because the shepherds that they had were failing them. The Pharisees and the religious leaders were piling upon them rule and regulation after rule and regulation, crushing their spirits. And that's when he spoke to them, he knew that they needed a good shepherd. Third, pray for someone you know who's going through a dark valley, that they receive rescue and restoration from the good shepherd. And maybe today that's you. Maybe you need to pray. You are walking through a dark valley and you need the rescue and the restoration. But if it's not you, pray for someone that you know. And then lastly, make a commitment to spiritually lie down this week in order to be healed or strengthened, and in order to allow the good shepherd to give you the care that he so desires to give you. So take just a moment or two if you want to pray, reflect, close your eyes, bow your head, whatever makes the most sense to you, as I still my voice and allow the voice of the Spirit to speak more loudly and clearly, and then in just a moment or two I will pray to close that time.